you know. We're gonna update the licensure according to the address today.
Yeah, there you go. See what I mean.
I've already noticed that it's not light outside. Anyway, because I like going outside. I actually do, especially because of the weather. So boring. It was nice. It was chilly. And I felt good. You see, I was dear friends, you know, the birds. Yeah. Teacher is very greenway. Okay. Haven't been up there since I started very greenway up there. And I've never had great. Well, that's the other thing that you're saying, like, it will be our teachers that make over.
Here's my D.
I don't know. I pretty much look like myself.
Yeah.
I'm not good at using the app. Like everybody.
Yeah, I'm not.
Okay.
I've been good about like trying to set it on the video setting.
How is there proposing?
But no, so I don't know why. Girls wish they didn't touch it. Like, it was like, I guess this is,
Oh,
I
it
think
is.
it's because it's showing
Yours is good. They want to get this.
setting.
I mean, sometimes you have to be very diligent about like doing it, like whatever. It's sensitive, but they prep it. Yeah. But that's what I'll be. I mean, it's very much like the Apple Watch thing. That's what I see all the Apple Watch users like doing.
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's good and it's great for
9 o'clock, I will call our board meeting to order, and pursuant to policy 1400, our workshop is always a committee of the whole. I'll ask Mr. Casey Griffin to call the roll to make sure that we do have a quorum. Casey?
Mr. Cobbins. Here. Mr. Darnell. Here. Mr. Eby.
Here.
Mr. Edwards.
Here.
Mr. Ferguson.
Here.
Ms. Kim. Here. Mr. Kraus. Ms. Tucker. Here. Ms. Hartgrove. Mr. Chair, you have 7 present members.
Thank you. We do have a quorum then, and so we're duly convened. And without objection, then according to policy 1400, I now resolve the board to the committee of the whole for the purpose of the workshop. Before we get started, I wanted to say a couple of things. One is that we had on the topic, one on the discussion on the accountability model, because Commissioner Swin can't be here today, and because that's such an important issue to work with the Department of Education and with the state board, we're going to postpone that. Tomorrow, I think we'll formally form a subcommittee to work with the State Department of Education and bring back to the board later this fall some actions if possible. With that, I will ask our Executive Director, Dr. Morrison, if she has any comments.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Just a few comments. We're excited for a very full day. Those of you that are going to be traveling with us, we'll start here this morning for our workshop and hear from a variety of presenters at the State Board and the Department about a couple topics that are of interest and importance to the board. And then we'll travel out to Smyrna and have lunch with the THEC Commission, the Higher Ed Commission, who we partner closely with. Mike Kraus, who's often with us, sits as an ex officio member on our board, and I sit as an ex officio member on their board. The July meeting is always challenging for both of us because we're meeting at the same time. So we'll have lunch with THEC. We'll join them for a tour of the Nissan plant and also be located then at the TCAT in Smyrna. We're going to hear from some folks in Rutherford County about some of the workforce development projects that they have going there. And then we'll also have a presentation from joint staff around how our students experience education across the state, kind of K through 16. So it's going to be an action-packed day. We're excited. And then tomorrow we'll reconvene here at TBR for our meeting. Additionally, I just want to take a quick moment before we get started to introduce a few new team members at the State Board. We've had a number of folks joining us this summer in various fellowship positions, and we've got a few new full-time staff members who I think are in the room. So when I say your name, if you're here, please stand up and we can acknowledge you. Nate Parker, I know, is here. He just joined our charter team, 2 weeks ago? And we're thrilled to have him joining Tess and Allie in the charter work. Erica Light, I think, is also here, and she'll be joining us very soon. She's not officially official yet, but she's already been taking time, like this morning, to come join us and shadow the work, so she's ready to start here in just a couple weeks. Catherine Johnson is in the same position, not same literally role position, but hasn't actually started yet, but will be soon. So we appreciate you being here this morning, Catherine. Catherine's going to be on the policy team as well with Erica, so both working with Amy Owen. Don Cheatham has done valuable work for us this summer, thinking about our educator prep partners and how we can learn from some of our top performers around the state. And he's done some really interesting research that all of you, I'm sure, will get to see here soon. Thank you, Don, for your time this summer. And Essence Thomas has been a policy fellow with us as well and is just coming to the end of her time this week, so we're thrilled you're here with us too, Essence. And then finally, Kelly Johnson is not with us, but I think I introduced her last meeting. She's just joined the charter team as well, and she got married, I think, last weekend, so she is still enjoying her honeymoon and will be reporting back to business pretty soon, right, Tess? So we're excited to have some new faces at the State Board office, and that's all the more reason why we need to move offices. So next time you come to find us in Nashville, we'll be at the Davy Crockett Tower instead of Andrew Johnson Tower, right down the street. That's all from me, Vice Chair. Thank you.
And I would be remiss not to say that Chairman Hartgrove is unable to attend today. She certainly will be missed, and that's why I'm sitting in this seat today. I will also say that I didn't have a gavel, so I asked Nathan James to get a gavel, and he went to the Senate, and then did he get a gavel? I promise I won't use it too often. Anyway, yeah, only when necessary. You hear that, Mike Edwards? So let's get started with our agenda. Our first item is proposed licensure actions. Brittany Kendrick, I believe.
Good morning, members. I'm Brittany Kendrick, and this is Hannah McCann. We are the attorneys dealing with the Educator licensure and proposed licensure actions. Before we get into those, also tomorrow you all will be voting on the Tennessee Department of Human Services defaults. Those are the educators that were reported by the Department of Human Services for being in default on either their child support, court-ordered child support, or alimony payments. They are suspended until they come into compliance with those obligations. And so since you all got the materials regarding the board meeting, there have been some changes to the list. So before I step down, I'll give you all the updated list for tomorrow. And then the main reason why Hannah and I are up here is to take any questions that you all may have regarding the proposed licensure actions that you all will be voting on tomorrow, and or letting us know which ones you would like to pull to discuss and vote on separately.
Are there any questions, Ms. Tucker?
I don't have any questions. I have 3 to pull.
Okay.
C, F, and I. And I think in my one-on-one call with the staff, we had a discussion, so I don't think that's a surprise.
Okay. Other questions? Or Ms. Kendrick?
Any others?
Okay. We will pull C, F, and I separately. The rest of them we'll vote on.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Owens, State Master Plan.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. Pleasure to be here with you this morning, sharing the recap presentation on our 2018-19 Board Master Plan. And tomorrow you'll be voting on first and final reading on the 2019-20 Master Plan. As you all know, this is formulated based on member priorities with staff input as well, and this guides the work of the staff and the things we make sure to bring to the board and the things that you prioritize for the coming year. So before we go ahead into our master plan for next year tomorrow, we wanted to take a little bit of time and see what our accomplishments have been over the past year and if anything has changed along the way from what we anticipated. In the master plan, we continue to pursue work in the same priority areas that we identified in 2016. For anybody who doesn't know, the board adopts 5-year student achievement goals and then an annual master plan that works toward those goals. We adopted 5-year student achievement goals back in 2015-16, which were to rank in the top half of states on NAEP, to achieve an average ACT composite score of 21, and to have the majority of high school graduates from the class of 2020 receive some kind of post-secondary credential. Over the past several years, we've worked toward these 4 strategic priority areas to try to achieve those 3 major goals. This is a little bit of the code for the PowerPoint. This is the same as we've used in previous years. If you see a little green check, that means the objective has been completed. The blue circle means it's in progress and on track, and a red empty circle means that it either did not occur or it needs some kind of additional focus. Our first priority area is high expectations and positive learning environments, which talks about our academic standards review, as well as ensuring that our classrooms are safe and secure learning environments that help our students reach high quality standards. Our first benchmark is around high expectations. Now, last July, when we set this master plan, we were still operating under the assumption that we needed to figure out a way in our current time frame of a 6-year cycle for standards and textbook adoption to get ELA and math standards back in sync with textbook adoption. A few years ago, when the state moved from Common Core to Tennessee academic standards, the standards review cycle got thrown off from the textbook adoption cycle. So we were thinking we would need to have some kind of small interim reviews. Instead, what happened was through the legislative work of Nathan and I know a lot of the advocacy from our board members, the legislature actually gave us an option to have additional flexibility to extend the math and ELA standards review cycles for one time for up to 3 years. That way we don't have to do too many short interim checks. We don't want to change standards too often on school districts and teachers. That's very confusing and can require additional training. It can affect the assessment. So instead, we revised this benchmark and we pointed out that with district and department input, we needed to finalize a plan on how to decouple the adoption cycle, decouple ELA and math, in other words, not have them in the same year, and to get them back in sync with textbook adoption. And we have done so. And we were working with the Textbook Commission and the Department of Education to develop a long-range plan for exact timelines there. Feel free to stop me along the way with any questions. Our next benchmark was on positive learning environments. We've achieved 2 of our goals here, and the third one we will have a presentation from the Department of Education at your November workshop. The first 2 goals were around student safety and security. You might remember at our meeting last October, we heard from Mike Herman on the school safety audits that occurred last summer, the first comprehensive audits in every single school district that resulted in them earning some additional grant funding that the governor allocated. And we're going to hopefully get some updates from the Department of Education on how those go this year as well. We also had the Tennessee Education Research Alliance come to our meeting in February and give us information on school climate, specifically how it affects teacher diversity and the relationship of school leaders to school climate. So I know we're excited to see the results of the 2019 Tennessee Educator Survey at a future meeting to see if we're making progress toward our school climate goals. Finally, we have not yet had a presentation or an update on the implementation of our new school counseling standards that were approved a few years ago. That was in part due to some staff transitions, a little bit of gap in coverage at the department in terms of school counseling, but also because we do want to be able to use data from this year's Educator Survey, specifically the school counselor module. So we look forward to sharing that in November. Sir.
Yes, Mr. Edwards.
So, when we adopted the new, we added a third component to what guidance counselors were supposed to do, and then we said that they could not deviate from those 3 more than 15%, which meant they could give tests and things like that. When you look at the number of the ratio between guidance counselors and teachers, I don't know how they do the first 3, let alone, and I think the third was career counseling.
Mm-hmm.
That all being said, that 15% becomes pretty sacred. And my question then was, because it's triggered with, we haven't gotten a report back yet. In my mind, if a guidance counselor were to keep a record of their time spent in each of those categories,
Mm-hmm.
and sign it and have the principal co-sign it, there could be some collusion there but at the same time you have a record of how they spent their time. And I don't know, other than that, it's going to be a very loosey-goosey monitoring system.
Sure, I definitely see what you're saying. And I believe we have self-reported data from the Tennessee Educator Survey asking school counselors how they spend their time. But I agree, it's hard to reflect back and even picture, over the last week, what did I do, let alone over a school year. So is that something you'd like us to flag for the November workshop?
I think it'd be very easy for, when you look at all the guidance counselors in Tennessee, for that 15% to easily be 40%,
Mm-hmm.
and it never, and those kids are going to go without. Even though that school has got to have people to administer tests. I mean, I don't quarrel with that. It's a tough problem to solve.
It is. Other questions on this priority area or in more areas where you want more information?
I think what Mr. Edwards says is something that we ought to look at, particularly as we look at BEP funding, et cetera, on how funding guidance counselors, if we knew better what they were spending their time on, that might impact funding.
Okay, great. Thank you. In a similar vein, our next priority area is great teachers and leaders. And our role here is really to establish policies to ensure that all students have access to great teachers and great leaders. And we do this through 3 benchmarks. The first area is educator preparation. As you all know, the board is charged in law with producing the annual educator preparation report card. We did produce the annual report card on time this February 15th. That's a legislative deadline, so we're very excited that that was produced on time and that the web tool was functioning as expected. We were able to add a leader preparation module for the first time for our programs that also prepare school leaders. Still kind of bare bones right now, really just looking at basic demographic information, but we look forward to building that out in the future. We're trying to raise awareness of the report card as a tool. We know our ed prep providers are using it. We're also trying to make it something that's more accessible to prospective students who are choosing between schools, to districts who are looking to partner or who need teachers from ed preps in their area. We did a lot of work this spring with a Humphreys International Fellow at Vanderbilt. She conducted stakeholder focus groups with prospective students at 5 ed prep programs. Nick was along for 3 of those in his region. We also spoke to school leaders and district leaders through our partners like TOS and some Department of Education working groups. So we've been identifying tools that would make the report card even more useful. For example, starting with a map of Tennessee, so you could click on your region and see where you want to go, or an easier way to sort and filter. So if you said, I want to be a high school science teacher, which are the programs that offer that endorsement? We met on Tuesday this week with our Educator Prep Report Card Advisory Council. We've had that advisory council convene every year for the last 4 years. It was a slightly different group of folks. Bob is our representative on it from the board. We also have Chairman Reagan from the House of Representatives. We have ed prep providers, public, private, and alternative, and we have school district staff. So they're helping us make sure that our report card for next year is the best it can be. We also last year wanted to issue a report specifically focusing on diversity and educator preparation. That's something that Don is working on this summer with us in his data and research project. He's from Vanderbilt as well. We've expanded the focus that we're looking at ways ed prep providers that have improved the most on different metrics in the report card have done so. We've published the report card in the same format for 3 years now, so we have data not just on how folks have improved in having candidates from more diverse backgrounds, but also in having candidates in high demand endorsement areas, improved observations once their candidates enter schools. So he's working on a case study report for us that will spotlight not only practices that improve diversity, but other things as well.
Ms. Tucker.
Wait your turn. Where are we on the educator satisfaction part of the report card?
It's a great question. We were just getting an update from the Department of Ed on Tuesday. We do have data from candidates who completed their programs in the last 3 years, how satisfied and prepared they felt. That's been coming out of the Tennessee Educator Survey, so we do have that data. The department is working on developing a survey for school principals that would, let's say, for example, Nick, Mike, and Wendy all went to the same school. It would have you grouped and say, thinking of Nick, Mike, and Wendy, what would you think about the program that prepared them? How satisfied are you with their level of preparation? That is still in development. To be honest, I would be surprised. I would be surprised if we were able to publish that in a scored fashion this year. I think we could share the data in an informational format, but since it would be such a new instrument, I think scoring it might be a little early.
So will I feel like I'm echoing. It's good as yours.
Yeah, I feel like I'm being really, really loud.
So will the teacher piece be part of it, the actual teacher satisfaction?
Yes, there will be different satisfaction. So there'll be an umbrella satisfaction domain and then different metrics below that.
But will the teacher one make it on for this next one? You said the other one you'd be surprised if it...
I am honestly not sure. That's going to be something we have to work through with our advisory council in terms of if they feel like it's ready to be scored and what the appropriate benchmarks would be.
Okay,
I'll give you all an update in November.
Thank you.
Mr. Edwards.
So, Amy, what's your sense of how seriously these EEPs are taking the diversity challenge?
I think it's extremely seriously. I think one thing that we're trying to do a better job capturing on the report card is that diversity can look different in different parts of the state. Obviously, there's the most academic research on the positive effects of racial and ethnic diversity on student outcomes, both students of color and white students as well. I think there's also an interesting case to be made for having male-female gender diversity, especially in the elementary grades where students are less likely to have male teachers. We might consider a way to incorporate that. We've also talked about the data would be tough to get, but whether or not we have socioeconomic diversity of candidates, for example, whether they are Pell eligible, whether they are first-generation college students. I think from our side, there's different ways we can look at diversity. From the EPP side, it's actually been so encouraging to talk to Don as he's talking to different programs, to talk to peers and partners at different ed prep programs. They're establishing different scholarships for students from typically underrepresented backgrounds. They're trying to work with on-campus groups, student groups for specific student populations. They're trying to go to them and say, you all could be great teachers. You have some characteristics that would make you really excellent teachers in the classroom. Examples would be in West Tennessee, there's a Call Me Mister program for having more and more African American male students enter the teaching profession. Lipscomb has the Pionero Scholars Program for students from Hispanic backgrounds, and there's several programs in East Tennessee as well. So I think they're very, very interested in this.
So would you say out of the 40-some odd programs that the vast majority take it seriously as a heart attack?
I really do. I think something that they continue to work with is at times a lack of diversity on their own campus. If you think about, you're recruiting from your immediate student body, I think that can be a challenge, and it's trying to, work with campus recruiting, campus admissions. How are we reaching out to groups of students that we haven't before, even beyond the ed prep level?
They're going to have to go outside and just like they would an athlete and recruit them.
Mm-hmm. The second benchmark in this area is around educator licensure. As you all know, the board sets rules and policies for how educators can obtain a teaching license. One policy change that occurred this past January 1st was to require the EdTPA performance assessment for teacher candidates. It's the first time it's been required statewide, and we are phasing in higher cut scores over the next 2 years, so that on January 1st, 2021, we will have the highest cut score in the nation on the EdTPA. We'll be at a score of 42. Something that the board wanted us to undertake last year is to start looking at the implementation outcomes and think about if there's any reasons or ways that we could revise the policy, incorporate EdTPA into the report card, just generally monitor implementation of this new requirement. That is something that's ongoing. We're only 6 months in, so it's a little bit too soon to have some kind of conclusion for you on how that's going. But we're certainly continuing to work with our ed prep partners. We spoke to several of the early implementers last year, folks who got going ahead of time, and they really spoke to the fact that it's a learning curve, and it's tough on students when you're going through preparing this portfolio, but then they come back during their first year of teaching and they say, that was the most useful thing I did. It is aligned to the team rubric expectations. I know what my principal's expecting of me. It was tough, but it was worth it. So that's something we're going to be sure to keep an eye on.
Do you have a question? Ms. Kim.
Can you remind me? Thank you. Can you remind me where 42? What is the cut score is 42, but what's the highest you?
It's 42 for most rubrics. Most rubrics are out of 75.
So 75 is
the highest. The highest.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question on, comment on licensure. Are you moving on to the next?
I'm going to do the last bullet point if that's okay. The other thing we wanted to do is work with the Department of Education, districts, ed prep programs, and other stakeholders to see what are the common roadblocks or examples of red tape in our educator licensure requirements and see if there are ways to ameliorate that. So we were able to work with the department. They have an annual survey of district leaders, and on their human capital module from last December, we were able to ask district HR professionals, what are your biggest barriers in terms of state rules and policies when it comes to hiring quality people? And based on that and feedback from the Educator and Prep subcommittee in April, we brought to you on final reading in May the licensure rule, which included some new flexibilities for folks who are coming from out of state on a professional license. as well as some other streamlined pathways. So we're excited about that work. We look forward to continuing it with our partners at the department.
Let me speak first.
Okay.
I'll just mention that yesterday in our Ed Prep Advisory Council meeting, what came out in spades, just like in the past, is the shortage and the crisis we have on quality teachers across the state. And I would like to see next year, when we come back with our master plan, something that focuses on what we as a state board can do and how we can work with the rest of the state in encouraging people to recognize that teaching is a profession that somebody can come in and make a great career out of and have a great purpose. We have got to encourage quality people in the teaching. That's the only way we're going to get good learning. And so I would like to see that as one of our goals for next year.
Great.
Mr. Edwards.
I could not agree more, and I would hope I insist that that be part of it. In order to encourage the kind of people to go into education that we're wanting to do, we're going to have to figure out what would it take to get them, what will attract them that we're not attracting now, and that's going to take some significant research. Mm-hmm. But I want to know why they're not going into education. Mm-hmm. To have a quality teacher means that they have the knowledge, content knowledge, and the skills. So it gets me back, and I understand we're not going to answer it today, but in October, when Ed TPA and Praxis is here, if we're scoring the highest cut score in the nation out of 42 out of 75, mm-hmm. that still doesn't instruct me as to how aligned they are in competency. I mean, an average cut score in the United States, you know, this country isn't really knocking it out of the ballpark. So if we're the highest, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to meet our standard goals, particularly that we're setting. If we're going to get great teachers, I want to know how they're trained and how we measure it, and they need to be telling us that. I'm glad we got the highest cut score. When I first got on the board, we did a number of sub-cut scores, and it was said at the microphone, sadly, that was in order to engineer enough teachers for the state to have enough to meet their need, which means we were cutting it down in order to generate that. I don't know if 42 or something provides quality teachers, and that's something that I personally want to be convinced of.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly that we need to have that. I think a challenge is what I hear from educators in my district and my own educators in my own kids' schools is when it's a challenge for them to be educators when they also have to get a night job or a summer job. And so we don't have the power to pay them more. And so until the funding formula piece is figured out, which is, above my free pay grade as an appointed board member, I don't think we're going to get the caliber people. I mean, if you can go to law school or business school and make a good living wage versus going to be a teacher, even if you really want to be a teacher, it's hard.
You're absolutely correct, Ms. Tucker. I will say, I see Dr. Lynch out there in the audience. He was mentioned yesterday that there's some districts that have 45 openings right now. And one thing we talked about was basically getting a map of how many openings there are across the state and how many on the average a year go. And we even heard some people talking about, warm bodies. They just get warm bodies, which is not the right thing to do. Luckily, and thank goodness, we do have Representative Reagan on the Ed Prep Advisory Committee, and he heard this yesterday. And I think what we have to do is continually raise that up to our legislators who do the vote and who do make those financial decisions, because that clearly is going to be something that's going to increase. Because when people have to make, that's their only income, and they have a family of 2 or 3 that they've got to support, and they're getting $35,000, $40,000 a year versus they can go someplace else. So this is, I think, is a crisis that we have within the state. I know Chairman Hartgrove has talked about that too, that we really have got to raise that level up and actively work on it next year.
All of this being said, if, and we know it will be, that compensation is a barrier to get these, we have, I would hope, to have the willingness to, as a board, to drive this home to all the stakeholders and not let up on it. And it will probably, being for higher wages is one thing, paying for it is another, and it's going to be painful. It's got to happen.
Thank you. The third benchmark under great teachers and leaders is around educator licensure discipline. Our state board legal team focuses on preparing cases for you all to vote on every quarter of educators who have some kind of misconduct in the classroom. Now, you'll note that everything on this slide is one of those in-progress bullets. In the ideal world, this work would end at some point, right? Because there'd be no more incidents of misconduct. But this work continues to be ongoing and in progress for our legal team every single month. The legal team brought on Hannah, our second staff attorney, last August to help ensure that cases are acted upon in a timely manner. So now the caseload is split between 2 attorneys. Additionally, the legal team hired a part-time paralegal, Christy White, to support the staff attorney and the assistant general counsel and reduce the time spent on administrative and case management tasks. The state board staff is also working on a robust legislative funding request to significantly build out the capacity of the legal team to best support the work of the board in this area. The legal team is also in the process of updating licensure rules and policies to ensure alignment with the Uniform Administrative Procedures Act and to provide additional clarity for educators and districts. These changes are reflected in the licensure discipline rule revision on final reading tomorrow and the corresponding changes to the licensure discipline policies that are on first reading. And finally, our legal team has engaged in comprehensive stakeholder engagement. In November, the staff attorneys gave a presentation to the Tennessee School Board Association Convention legal workshop on reporting requirements and investigations, and they've been invited to present again this year at the 2019 convention. Other presentations have included the Mid-Cumberland and South Central Superintendent Study Committees, the Tennessee Council of School Board Attorneys, Winter Continuing Legal Education event, and they've discussed this at all days in the district with the Superintendent Study Council meetings. They continue to work with the Tennessee Association of School Personnel Administrators, or TASPA, and our chairwoman Lillian Hartgrove and Sarah gave a presentation to the Tennessee Organization of School Superintendents Legislative Conference that included this information. Additional engagement with private school and charter school membership organizations is planned for 2019-20.
Questions? I have one. So we talk about misconduct, and we talk about, reporting on the number of misconduct cases, and we see that growing year to year to year. What, within the ed prep providers, do they offer courses in teacher ethics and things to do and not to do?
It's a fairly recent legal requirement, is that correct, for educator preparation providers to train their candidates on the Tennessee Teacher Code of Ethics. So that became legislation, I think, in 2018.
Mr. Edwards?
Is that curriculum standard?
It is not at this time. I will say at the August Licensure and Preparation Subcommittee meeting, you will be hearing from ETS. They have a new program called Pro Ethica that is, it's an online program that's designed to help educators think through different ethical dilemmas and what the consequences of their actions could be. So that's something that some individual school districts have adopted in Tennessee, and they wanted to share that information with the board as well.
So how do we know when they come out, having looked at something online or even taken this seminar, that they have a grasp of what to do and not to do?
I don't know that we have that at the state level.
We need it.
And 2 points. First, most of the licensure action stuff that we see, you shouldn't have to take a class to know that you don't send pictures of your body parts to students, and, you don't, I don't know, drink out of your water bottle at your desk and pass out cold. So most of it, I don't think, like, that statute is great, but most of what we see anyway. But I want to circle back to Mr. Cobbins made a suggestion repeatedly now, and I don't know if we figured out where we have the power to do it, but on the student side. And I don't know where we are on that, and I want to give you credit for that idea, but it's each time you raise it, so I would love to get some feedback on that.
I remember at the previous meeting, actually several meetings, Daryl raised the point that there should be some training for students on what the appropriate boundaries are with their teachers, so that if somebody were to act inappropriately to them, they would be aware of it. We do have the health and wellness standards in the state that at each grade level have a component addressing what appropriate relationships and boundaries look like. Now, it is not specific to what your teacher should or shouldn't do. It is more toward safe relationships with the adults in your life overall. When the health and wellness standards come around for their 6-year review, which should be in just a couple years here, we could go ahead and add that in, but I'm open to other ways to think about how to do that in a more expedited timeline.
If I could just add to this, and I appreciate your comments, because when you read through these licensure actions, it really kind of wakes you up and makes you question a lot. But my question is, do we know how Tennessee compares to other states, maybe in the southeast or wherever, in terms of some kind of ratio to staff to licensure actions?
I don't off the top of my head. I don't know if anybody on our legal team has information. Brittany Kendrick.
We have had a policy fellow look at that information in the past, but we haven't actually synthesized it all. I have noted several times in our case review meetings that we actually just got an email back from Alabama's Department of Education, and in that email it mentioned that they usually receive approximately 1,500 reports and complaints over a year. 300 of them are usually from school districts, like what we get. So, and I also have noted just in my practice of this work that we are in line in terms of like harshness and just what we take actions for is very similar across the board. But we haven't had any like formal review of the Southeast or other states, but we are working on getting that information and can get that for you all in the future.
Thank you.
I think we ought to make sure that we also state that there's 76 or some odd thousand teachers in Tennessee, and if you add up what we see annually, it is a very small percentage and probably mirrors any other employer percentage-wise. It may be lower than most. Now, we see some pretty egregious stuff, but we got 76-something thousand employees. I mean, you're going to have it.
Sure. Our third priority area is high-quality school options. In the recent years, this has specifically focused on the board's charter school work. We're going to expand that a little bit in the coming year, which we'll see in the master plan for 2019-20 tomorrow. But over the past year, we've been looking at 2 different benchmarks, one on charter school authorization. As you all obviously know, we are an LEA for 3 of our authorized charter schools. So we had several different benchmarks in this area. Some are completed and some continue to be ongoing. This is work that is just perpetual. Both the annual authorizer fee report and the annual authorizer report were published by the State Board last fall and are currently available on the State Board's website. The oversight and monitoring of our authorized charter schools is ongoing. The State Board staff completed the required annual site visits for Bluff City High School and Kip Antioch College Prep Elementary this spring. The charter team is currently working on the performance frameworks for both schools and hosting end-of-the-year meetings with school leadership to review preliminary results from the framework, as well as discuss plans and really finalize plans at this point for the upcoming school year. KIPP Nashville has completed the construction of its Antioch campus, and KIPP Antioch College Prep Elementary has moved into the facility, which is very exciting. The elementary school will have kindergarten and first grade in the upcoming school year. Additionally, we've wrapped up the pre-opening process for KIPP Antioch College Prep Middle, and the school is slated to open August 5th with its inaugural 5th grade class. The State Board was approved for 2 additional staff positions to support the LEA and charter authorizing work of the State Board, and these positions will focus on oversight and monitoring of special populations and federal programs. Our second area of work regarding charter schools is on charter school rules and policies. The State Board staff monitored implementation of the quality authorizing standards in each appeal received by the board during the past year. It will continue to evaluate implementation of quality standards in future appeals. Additionally, the State Board staff reviewed annual authorizer reports that were submitted to the department for alignment to the quality authorizing standards. The authorizer fee rule was effective in April 2019, and the projected charter school budgets for the 2019-20 school year are due from districts to the department by August 1st, and that's something that our State Board district will comply with. These must be posted online by August 15th, and we'll share the information with the board once it's posted. The second reporting requirement this year will be the report of expenses charged to the authorizer fee for the 2018-19 school year, and that's due to the department by December 1st. And I know our charter team will keep you up to date with that work as well. Questions in this area? Okay. Nathan James will join me to discuss the 4th priority area, public engagement and oversight.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. The strategic priority of public engagement and oversight, we commit to collaborative governance, effective oversight, and engagement with the citizens of Tennessee. We recognize the unique role of the board as envisioned by the late Lieutenant Governor John Wilder as the people's voice in education, placing us as actively engaged partners both with the governor and the General Assembly. Moving on to the first benchmark of collaborative governance, the State Board of Education's members and staff will engage with other agencies in state government and contribute to collaborative efforts on behalf of Tennessee students. Now, how this translates out is that the staff of the State Board sits on over 15 boards, commissions, and task forces, blue ribbon panels, and the like. These range from statutorily required organizations and committees to scholarship and cross-governance initiatives with our higher education partners as related to every aspect of education and the workforce. Another one is the BEP Review Committee. We lead the work of multiple agencies with the BEP Review Committee, and this important committee has successfully championed some of the changes and some of the improvements that have been discussed in the earlier sections. For instance, the 11th and 12th month of insurance for our educators, the inclusion of RTI squared in the BEP formula, the increased technology funding, as well as greater focus on school counselors and other school support personnel. This committee is an important advocacy and advisory body. So we also look to other ways that we've been involved. We collaborate with the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. Indeed, the meetings with THEC have become increasingly valuable, as we will again demonstrate later today. In 2018, the two bodies adopted a joint resolution committing to the goal of increasing the number of third graders reading on grade level, which was delivered to the new administration and the education committees at the beginning of this year. Also, we've talked about the Tennessee Teacher Prep Report Card, Advisory Council, and other subcommittees on licensure and prep and charter schools. Have heard from state and external stakeholders and researchers and so on. This also gets in the area of our subcommittee appointments. Looking at effective oversight. Our benchmark here is the State Board of Education will work to ensure that the rules and policies it enacts are effective and supporting student success. It's part of the ethos of this board and each of you as appointees to make sure that the educational enterprise in Tennessee always has the student as its focus. We've partnered with the Governor and General Assembly to faithfully execute the legal responsibilities of the board, which are myriad. Ensure that the excellent independent research actively informs members' decisions on all policies and rules. This has been a matter that of extreme importance to you as board members to make certain that you are hearing from the staff here as well as from other impartial bodies and resources in terms of your decision as a board member. The legal charge of the board being varied and broad, we're also involved every step of the way in the creation of the laws that govern what the board has to do. And that means some of the legislative outreach that each of you have done in the past year has been incredibly important. Looking around, we were the only institution of state government that met with 26 of the 30 incoming freshmen this last year, and that is largely due to the efforts and work of each of you as individual board members taking time from your day job to go and get that done. Let's also remember that the board conducts periodic review of rules and policies, both for efficacy and modernity, as you'll see tomorrow with several of the items that are up. So finally, we get to the benchmark of board member engagement. The members of the State Board of Education will make a concerted effort to reach out to stakeholders within their districts and across the state. And as you see, this is an ongoing benchmark. This work will never come to completion, but it is tremendous the amount of effort that each of you put into it. In 2018, for example, when we just talk about days in the district, we had Nick came on board, and within the first 6 months of his appointment, he held 2 days in the district, one in far-off Mountain City, Tennessee, which you just can't get there from here. But he insisted he wanted to make certain that the folks up there knew that it was important to him that their voices be heard. So we had 2 in the 1st Congressional District, 1 in the 3rd Congressional District, with the 4th and 2nd represented. And we also had the 5th and 7th Congressional Districts with a day in the district. This outreach, coupled with continuous interaction with directors of LEAs and through the work of the Director Study Councils that each of you meet with, has been so important. Developing and maintaining these relationships have really paid dividends, I would say. In 2019, in 2019, we will continue with the maintenance of our relationships with legislators across the state, and I'll be contacting each of you to set up times to have follow-up meetings. I'm happy to take any questions.
I'll just say this is one of the most important things we do is to work with our constituents, and thank you, Nathan. And Mr. Darnell, thank you for engaging as quickly as you did.
Very quickly wrapping us up, I know that this is a topic that gets us all really excited and engaged. That's a look back at what we did the previous year. Tomorrow we'll present the 2019-20 master plan, but as a quick recap, the steps to develop the master plan for the coming year were that members and staff all took a survey to identify your priorities, things you wanted to change, things you wanted to add or remove. Staff compiled a draft that you all looked at the beginning of the May meeting. We had some non-deliberative planning time together. In June, we've worked one-on-one over email with members and phone call to finalize your priorities and revise the draft. And we're presenting our accomplishments from last year today, and you'll see the new master plan tomorrow. So I know you've been so engaged along the way, but if you have any final questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Just one question. Those items that did have the open bullets, we will continue to track those. And
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Miller.
Thank you.
Education savings account, somebody from the State Department.
Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Fivash, the Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Legislation. I'm here to provide a update on where we are in the implementation process for the Education Savings Account program. As a refresher, Public Chapter 506 established the Education Savings Account program, which will allow eligible students in Shelby County, Metro Nashville Public Schools, and the Achievement School District to receive funding that they can then use for certain education expenses. To be an eligible student, the student must have either been enrolled in a Tennessee public school for the full school year prior to enrollment, or be entering a Tennessee school for the first time, and then they must also meet certain income requirements. Students that participate in the program must be enrolled in a Category 1, 2, or 3 private school, although the school doesn't necessarily have to be a participating school. And then students do also have to participate in the TCAP test for math and ELA while they're enrolled in the program. The ESA funds can be used for things like tuition and fees at a participating school, textbooks, tutoring services, school uniforms, and certain post-secondary expenses. The amount that each student will receive in their ESA is the statewide per pupil average, which will be around $7,500, or the district per pupil amount if the district amount is lower than the $7,500 amount. The legislation also creates a school improvement grant, and during the first 3 years of the program, those funds will be used to reimburse the districts for students that enroll in the ESA program. And then after the first 3 years, the funds will be available to all districts that have priority schools. Enrollment in the program, the legislation requires it's no later than the 2021-22 school year. But as you all are aware, the governor has tasked the department and the state board with implementing the program with quality as soon as possible. And so we are working toward enrollment in the program for the 2020-21 school year. There's obviously a tremendous amount of work that has to be done before that time. And our commissioner has tasked our deputy commissioner, Amity Schuyler, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, with leading this work. So she is focused on really trying to make sure that we are doing things as quickly but as accurately as possible. Her first steps have really been to reach out to other states with similar types of programs to learn about their implementation, challenges, successes, and what we can extract from what they have seen as they've gone through this. She has had numerous conversations with Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina. Although none of those states have a program that exactly matches the ESA program, we've been able to sort of take different information from each of those states to help us as we're working toward implementation. The TDOE team and the state board staff have been working very closely on the drafting of the rule and policies for the program. We've made a lot of progress on that, and the plan is to bring a draft of the rule to first reading at the September special meeting. The main things that we are looking at trying to flesh out in those rules are around the income verification requirements, the requirements for participation, requirements for the schools, and the lottery process. Additionally, outside of the rules, we are working to really get all of the systems in place for strong implementation, such as the application processing system, payment management, and all of the fiscal controls. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but again, we're making a lot of really strong progress and have been working very, very closely to try to get this right and done quickly. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Tucker.
Good morning. Something you said caught my ear because I didn't quite understand it. You talked about participating schools having to be category 1, 2, or 3, but then you said they don't necessarily have to be a participating school, and that confuses me. So can you clarify that, please?
Yes, and it is slightly confusing. So In order to use the ESA funds on tuition, the school has to be a participating school.
Okay.
If the student is not enrolled in a participating school, they still have to be enrolled in a Category 1, 2, or 3 school. They just could not use those ESA funds for tuition. They would have to use them for one of the other approved education expenses.
And what other approved education expenses would be up to $7,000?
So it could be the tutoring services, certain therapies, not tuitions, textbooks. It could be some for post-secondary expenses if they were enrolled in a dual enrollment, dual credit. They could use it for the cost of the ACT or SAT. So there are several other expenses that it could be used for.
So, and you mentioned therapy, so students with disabilities can access the ESA or the IEA, but they would have to choose, correct?
That is correct.
And is there something in the ESA, there were a lot of versions of this bill, so is there something in the final version of this bill that requires a student with a disability to waive their federal protections similar to what's in the IEA bill?
Yes, that is in here as well.
Okay, and then, I won't go forever, sorry. I'll have plenty of questions in September, I'm sure you're not surprised. Speaking of the IEA though, this board has spent a lot of time with Ms. Wright going through those rules, and that program obviously isn't identical, but it has a lot of similarities. I'm hoping that the department folks are using that in some ways as a guide as they're beginning to develop this, because I think we were very thoughtful, or tried to be thoughtful, about parent involvement and accessibility and those sorts of things. So are they looking at that and all these other states?
Yes, absolutely. We started with the IEA rule as sort of our base and made adjustments and additions from there, so absolutely.
Mr. Cobbins?
In the, I guess in the process of, seems to be fast tracking this to meet the deadline, are we looking at other states and potential pitfalls that they went through to avoid those this go around?
Yes, absolutely, and we did a lot of this also with the IEA program, and Arizona in particular had a sort of rocky launch of the program, and so they have been able to provide a lot of good feedback around strong fiscal and monitoring controls, and so we're definitely incorporating the feedback that we received from them to try to prevent some of the challenges that they had.
This obviously is a very transformational process as we're going through, and just like any project, I would assume that you have some kind of a schedule or guideline process that you're going to go through. At what point in time do you make the decision, in fact, we are going to go for the 2021, or that we are going to put off 21 to 2022? Where is that within our schedules?
So I think that will depend on a lot of factors, some which are outside of the control of the department or the state board. We are working on an internal timeline that we feel will get us to the 2020 deadline with quality. And so right now we're just monitoring where we are on sort of the internal things that we know that we have to accomplish, and if we throughout the process see that we're falling behind, we will definitely reassess and make adjustments. But right now that is the timeline that we feel that we can accomplish, but we're not going to move forward if we don't feel that it's going to be successful, or that there'll be challenges, that it will be difficult for students or parents. We want everyone to be able to enroll as seamlessly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the process that you plan on is the students and the parents to make their decision on what they're going to do. So hopefully
Absolutely.
Ms. Tucker.
And Ms. Feidash, you keep talking about the quality implementation, and obviously I know that is a key focal point for the department. It's clearly a focal point for us as we develop these rules and policies. I guess, is there a plan for something to be in the rules and policies that is a quality check around like the process? And I understand, like, I know and again, there have been a lot of versions of the rule. I know that for purposes of apples to apples comparison for students in the program, I think the participating schools will have to do some of the same statewide testing, right? So you'll have that sort of, if those schools are providing quality, but is there something that is envisioned to be a quality check on the process and the rollout?
That's not something that's in our current draft, but we can certainly talk with you about establishing some sort of, checkpoints that you all may want to be kept apprised of along the way. We can certainly work with you to develop that.
Just two thoughts on that note. I mean, I know with the IEA law, we had an advisory council that was convened and regularly met, and then the state board heard an annual report about who's participating, how's it going. Something like that I think absolutely would make sense for this program, given that it's going to be much bigger in nature and reach more students across the state. And then separately, I was just going to respond to Bob's question. The board staff has been most directly involved working with Elizabeth and others at the department on the rulemaking, obviously, because that's the piece that we'll be asked to vote on. And so Angie in particular has been working very closely with Elizabeth and others on the draft. And as Elizabeth said, I think we are feeling good about a near final first draft based largely on the IEA rule. But in terms of the timeline, that was our biggest initial concern, just given sometimes the length of time the AG's office and others involved need to review those rules, the rulemaking hearing process. So we've been on a weekly call now with the governor's office and with the department working through that timeline to make sure we're in step with each agency and we're on track for this 2020 launch, which the governor has asked for. And I think that, again, given everybody's willingness to participate and expedite the review, I think we'll be on track, but we'll continue to keep you up to date if anything changes. And that's also the reason for one of the reasons for the September special called meeting. We'll hear this on first reading at that time.
Thank you. I apologize. I'm an engineer, so I'm very linear in thinking in a lot of ways, and the latest thing out. There's a lot of things that could go wrong with this, and we just need to be prepared to address those. Thank
Absolutely. Thank you.
you. Okay. English as a second language program policy updates. Oh, we want to take a break? How about?
I was going to take a quick one.
That's all right. Let's take a 10-minute break. How's that? Okay. 10:10. ESL program policy updates.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. My name is Katie Barcy, and I am the Assistant Director of English Learner and Immigrant Programs at the department. And I have with me Adam Rollins, who is a Senior Research Strategist at the department. And we are here today to provide an overview of the major components of the proposed changes that we have for the ESL program policy, on which you'll be voting tomorrow on first reading. And I want to kind of lay out a little bit the presentation just to give you a sense. We're going to begin by talking about our proposed changes to the WIDA access exit criteria, and then we'll move to talk about the WIDA alternate access changes, and finally at the end we'll talk about the impact of both of those collective changes. So that's kind of the layout of the presentation. And so before we go into the technical aspects of the exit criteria, I just want to provide a little bit of background and context as to what these exit criteria really mean for a student in Tennessee. I have a little illustration up here. We have two different English learner students, and they are both in ESL services throughout the year. And in the spring, all English learners across the state take an English language proficiency assessment. And so in Tennessee, we administer the WIDA access or the WIDA alternate access as that assessment. And if the student scores at a certain threshold or higher, they would exit from ESL services, or they would continue ESL services if they don't reach that score threshold. And that is the exit criteria, and that is what we as a state agency are responsible for determining for students. And so you can see here, the student at the top would have their year of ESL services. They would take the assessment in the spring, but they have a little red line there, so they didn't meet the threshold, and then they would continue with ESL services in the next year. But the student at the bottom, if they continue with ESL services throughout the year, take the spring assessment, reach the exit criteria, in the following academic year, they then move into what we call the transition phase for students. They're no longer receiving direct ESL services, but they are being monitored by their classroom teachers, and through that monitoring process, they are getting additional language supports as needed. So while they're not entirely out of ESL services, they're still receiving supports that they might need. They're not receiving those direct ESL services from an ESL teacher. And so that's what this exit criteria is we're deciding that threshold at which a student would then be able to leave direct ESL services and just receive those transitional supports. So a little bit of background on why we want to do this. As student proficiency shifts over time, and as we have more TN Ready data over time and we can see student performance shift, we really want to make sure that our English learners are exiting services at a point at which they have the language and literacy skills that they need to be able to meaningfully participate in their coursework, in the general education setting, and in their content courses. So we really want to make sure that we're setting exit criteria at a point where they have meaningful access to their course content. And then when we can be sure that they have that meaningful opportunity to participate in courses, we're opening up more opportunities for them, both academically and non-academically. We want to make sure that when they leave those supports behind, that they have everything they need to be as successful as possible in the classroom. Absolutely.
So when you say as successful as possible, as English English second learners, they're going to be at a rate obviously flatter than people who speak English as their mother tongue. Once they get to some level of adequacy, how do they catch up on the coursework?
It's actually interesting. We've seen in Tennessee that our former English learners, so the students who've exited services, are actually improving at some of the fastest rates across the state on TN Ready. So probably likely because of a lot of those additional supports and a lot of that learn another language and learn content in another language, we're actually seeing them improve pretty dramatically on TN Ready.
Cool.
Yeah, it is cool. So it's important to begin by laying out a little bit of information about what the WIDA access actually looks like before we go into specifically the proposed exit criteria. The WIDA Access has a scale of 1.0 to 6.0, and that is across all of the different scoring elements that you see up here. They test language across the domains, so you have your reading scores, your writing scores, speaking scores, and listening scores, and those scores roll up into bigger categories of scores. So your reading and your writing roll up into a literacy score, and your speaking and listening roll up into an oral language score. And those two pieces, the oral language and the literacy, create the composite score. And you can see that the oral language and literacy are weighted differently. In the composite score, literacy is 70% of that composite score, and oral language is 30% of that composite score. So what we are proposing is to move from our current exit criteria of a composite score of 4.2 and a literacy score of 4.0 to increase those exit criteria to a composite of 4.4 and a literacy score of 4.2. And I just want to lay out why we have two criteria for exit, not just composite, is we want to make sure that students don't just have the language skills that they need, which you would get from a composite score. We also want to make sure that they have the necessary literacy skills so that they can really, truly participate in their coursework. There is a difference in communication between being able to have really great fluent conversations on the playground and with your teachers versus being able to read a textbook and absorb that content and understand it. So that's why we have both a composite and a literacy score as a part of the exit. And so I'm going to let Adam step in to talk a little bit about exactly how we get from that 4.2 to 4.4, and he'll be able to provide you with some of our analysis.
So the data you're looking at is for grade 3 only, and it's for English language arts outcomes only. But I'm using it as an example to explain the process that we use, and you want to keep in mind that we repeat this process for each grade band and for both ELA and math outcomes. So I've circled for you the proposed new exit criteria in green, and for comparison, you can see the current exit criteria circled in red. But the final recommendation is not made just based on one graph alone, but rather it's calculated after we've analyzed each grade band and each content area and then weighted the results accordingly. So we use this descriptive box plot analysis where if you move from left to right across the chart, you can see that each box plot represents a distribution of TN Ready scaled scores earned by English learners at each WIDA composite level. And then on the far right, you see the distribution of scores for their English-only peers. And the red line indicates the median score for English-only peers. And if it's helpful, you can think of these box plots as like a traditional bell curve where the bulk of the scores are represented by that box and the thinner tails of the bell curve are represented by those lines. And so the point of intersection that we want to identify is where the bulk of scores for English learners overlaps with the bulk of scores for their English-only peers. And so we use a decision rule that the box at that WIDA level must capture the median of their English-only peers in order for that score to be included in the overall weighted calculation. And so in this grade 3 example, you can see that the majority of English learners at our current exit criteria are actually scoring a little bit below the median of their English-only peers. And so it illustrates for us the need for a higher exit criteria.
And we are happy to take any questions you have about the WIDA access portion. We are going to talk about the WIDA alternate access and then the overall impact.
Questions? So when I understand your graph here and why you go from 4.2 to 4.4, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I remember, is 3.5 some regulatory number or something like that they're required to provide funding for a certain period of time or something?
It's not necessarily funding, it has to do with the amount of service time.
Okay,
So
service
there's
time.
score kind of categories for the amount of service time students need. So below that 3.5, they would need an hour of services a day, and then above that, they can have it tailored. So if they are more proficient and they don't actually need a pull-out ESL class, for example, they might actually just get their services through push-in in their general education setting, if that's what works for
Yeah.
them.
So my question is they're required up to 3.5 for a certain time, and then after that, it's kind of the services are determined by the school. Have you worked with the LEAs to determine the impact of raising this from 4.2 to 4.4? And if there's no requirement for the service time that they have above 3.5, how are you assured? I mean, they may just be sitting in there, twiddling their thumbs or something like that. How are you sure that they're going to get the service time to get them from 4.2 to 4.4?
That's a good question. Districts have a lot of autonomy in how they determine those services. What we have put in place is individual learning plans for students. So what teachers and schools should be doing is using those individual learning plans to determine the best possible service times for students. We've also asked them to incorporate growth trajectories into those service plans, those individual learning plans, so that they can actually map out what the students' projected growth would be over time. And so those are tools available to them in figuring out how long it would take for them to reach exit. And we've worked with one of our ESL regional advisors to develop an interactive tool that they can use to get a better sense of where their students should be moving in terms of their progress.
And have you asked them how much this is going to cost them to go from 4.2 to 4.4?
We do have an impact analysis at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I forget every time. So conceptually, my heart warms up to the idea that the bar goes higher, because typically when the bar goes higher, people will jump to it. Although I think in this case, I had some of the similar questions, about fiscal impact. Because in MMPS alone, we have 20 vacancies in this space, and it seems to me that if you raise this, that is a very big decision. Again, doesn't mean you don't do it, but I would think we would need to be more than eyes wide open on the overall impact on recruiting, placement, and then of course there's the fiscal part of it. So that's one thought. So I really want to better understand what is driving the 4.2 to 4.4, and what services do we think would need to be true to get in place, I guess? What services need to be in place to get from a 4.2 to a 4.4?
So our major concern was that we wanted to make sure when we exit students from ESL services that we're exiting them at a point where we feel like they will be able to access their core content coursework. And as we get more TN Ready data and TN Ready performance shifts over time, we need to recalibrate these exit criteria every once in a while just to make sure that we're not exiting students too early. So while they may perform at the exit criteria and performance has shifted over time, they may then be going into their general education coursework and not be able to be successful, which then means they may end up ultimately getting reclassified back into ESL services. So we really want to make sure we're exiting the students from that student perspective at a point that is going to be as successful for them as possible. And in terms of getting districts to think about how they can push students from that 4.2 to 4.4, we've actually spent a lot of time this year building out our ESL regional advisor team, which are 8 contracted staff that we have that work in different regions across the state to really push districts to think about different instructional methods that they can use, and we're really trying to use them as a resource to better assist districts in being able to think more creatively and collaboratively about how they provide ESL services for students. But it is also important to note that when thinking about those exit criteria, we are setting this for next year. So districts would have a year to kind of prepare for this. This is not something that we're asking them to do right now. It's something that would be coming down the road. So they would have some time to think and prepare. And hopefully with those growth trajectories that they do as a part of their ILPs, they'll be able to possibly get a sense of how many students would be exiting to begin that planning process.
And to what degree is this new proposal in line or out of line with federal?
We are in line with federal. States have the option of setting those exit criteria, and they're actually obligated to set it at a point in which students can demonstrate proficiency. And so this is the methodology we are using to make sure that our students can demonstrate proficiency in English.
And what are the potential downstream? I guess I'm still not understanding the real difference between 4.2 and 4.4. So it'd be great to get raw numbers, like how many, like, although I guess, okay, should I just wait?
There, it is later.
There's later, but we can talk about it now.
So, yeah, like then are we going to talk in some detail about inclusion too?
Possibly we can. What we focus on in our impact is looking at the number of students that would continue to stay in the English learner pool. So we would see a decrease in the number of students exiting if we were to use the data that we have from this year and apply that same exit criteria. So the pool of English learners across the state would increase. It doesn't impact BEP funding because BEP funds students who are active English learners and students in their first 2 years of transition. So you could think of this exit criteria as kind of like a line, and the district receives BEP funding whether or not the student is on this side of the line as an English learner or this side of the line as a recently transitioned out of ESL services student. So the districts still receive BEP funding for those students whether they're on this side of the line or that side of the line for the first 2 years of the student's transition. So for funding, it shouldn't impact districts in that manner.
Okay. Maybe I'll save my, I kind of do want to delve into inclusion, but we can proceed and then I'll wait till the end.
Okay.
So I've heard anecdotal evidence and anecdotal shouldn't go together, but they do. But I've heard anecdotally of situations in MNPS where students were exited out and then struggled, and were sent back in. So I applaud the department looking at that and figuring this out. Now I'm with Ms. Kim. I'm not sure if I'm not smart enough to know if 4.4 is going to make a difference, if districts are going to step up and get there. But I have heard about that sort of out and in at the current level. I wanted to ask a question that's a little bit outside of this. Get a look from the vice chair here, but the ILPs that you mentioned, that's individualized learning plans, right?
Yes.
It's like IEPs for kids, EL learners.
Yes, without all of the same, without all the legal components, right?
Yeah. So are we one of the only state that does that? That's not a normal thing, right?
That is a good question. I don't know exactly the number of states doing it. I can get that information for you.
I think it's a pretty unusual and a pretty progressive thing to do. So I wanted to applaud you guys for that. So I have some fellows who will be here tomorrow during this conversation who've been digging into sort of our English learner stuff, and they applauded the work that's being done at the department. So one of the questions I wanted to ask about that, and I'm going to ask about it in more detail tomorrow when we're going through this, is the sort of, you may not know the answer to this, the legal authority for the ILP, like where that came from.
I can find that out for you. I think it's more just a policy decision on our end to do that. We really just want to put all of the tools in place to ensure that students are getting instruction that's individualized for them, with hopefully that being the goal of moving them from that 4.2 to 4.4 is focusing on more individualized instruction students to meet their needs.
Okay, and we can talk about it. I think it may have come from the Equal Education Opportunity Act, but anyway, that's going to lead me to more questions tomorrow, so TBD.
I'll mention one other anecdotal comment is I have heard that actually once you get them into the classroom, a lot of them do better than they do in the ESL. And so my question is how in the future do we follow students to see first, how long do we expect them to take to go from 4.2 to 4.4? Is that 1 year? Is that 6 months? Or what is your data show on that? And then following when they get out, do we continue to follow them to see how they're doing in the classroom?
We do keep track of that data. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we can get those for you. And we do really want to encourage districts, as you mentioned, that students might actually perform better in the general education classroom in more of a push-in setting. And so when we're thinking about what would be best for those more advanced students, so the students who are at 4.4 right now and could move to, or 4.2 and could move to 4.4, we would really encourage districts, instead of just using the same ESL program model for all students pull out, to really think about how they could push those students in to the classroom so that they're getting a lot more exposure to authentic English with their peers, which for many of them may actually be more helpful in terms of learning English than just in the outside separate classroom. So we do have a lot of program models, and we encourage districts very strongly to not just use one model and to really think about how they're placing students. Okay, great, we can move on. Now we're gonna talk a little bit about our WIDA alternate exit criteria. And just a quick background on the WIDA alternate assessment. This is the WIDA assessment that is for students with significant cognitive disabilities. It's a new assessment for us here in Tennessee. We started the administration of this assessment in 2017, and it's typically administered to a very, very small group of students in the state. It's usually somewhere around 1% of our English learners in the state. And something that is important to note is that this assessment is scored differently than the WIDA Access. You'll see that the WIDA Access is that 1.0 to 6.0. The WIDA alternate is A1 through A3 and P1 through P2. And there's no decimals. And so that's why when we're proposing our exit criteria, it's going to look very different than what we have for our WIDA Access. Our proposed criteria for the WIDA alt is to set a composite score of P1 or higher and a literacy score of P1 or higher. And again, we're using that composite and literacy to make sure that we have enough information about students so that we can be sure that they don't just have language skills, but the literacy skills that they need to be successful in school. And I'm going to hand off to Adam again, who's going to walk you through the analysis we used to determine these exit criteria.
It's quite a similar process as you see, the difference being the scoring scale, only a 5-point scale here. And we also don't have the sample size where we can repeat this by grade band using the WIDA alt. So we simply do it once for ELA and once for math. And once again, I've given you the ELA example here where we're looking at where the intersection is between the WIDA alt and the MSAA, which is the alternate assessment for TN Ready. Using this methodology, we identified the P1 level, and the same is true in math, and so we feel very confident with that recommendation to you.
Was there a scaled score prior to this, or is this just setting it for the alt?
This is just setting it for the
Okay. Familiar with the alt that is not for students that are English language learners. So I'm curious of what this alt test actually looks like. Is this like an online, just like the regular alt, or do you know?
It does look pretty different. I'm not super familiar with like exactly what it looks like. I can get you their information about that if you would like to see just exactly how it differs. It does differ from the WIDA Access.
Okay. And this A1, A2, A3, P1, like, what does that stand for? What does that mean?
They have labels. I didn't write them down. It's like initiating, developing. You know, they have labels that.
Those are just different score bands that they have. They do have terms that they typically use, like emerging and initiating, developing, et cetera, for those.
So I would love a little more information generally about this. I feel like, I just feel like this is sort of in a vacuum. We're just saying circle P1. We don't know what P1 means. We don't know how you get a P1. We don't know what the things below it or the things above it mean. And so it feels like it's really in a vacuum. And I mean, I have feelings about the regular alt, and I may have feelings about this alt, but I don't even know enough to have feelings.
Ms. Kim, do you have a question?
Okay, great. So now we can move on to impact. I'll just share with you the estimated impact. We used the WIDA access data from 2018-19 to look at where these exit criteria would fall. And you can see that our exit rates for students, if we were to apply these exit criteria, would decrease by about 4% across the state. And you can see at our current criteria, the number of students we had exit from ESL services, and under the proposed criteria, the number of students who would exit. And I want to point out that that proposed criteria does include WIDA access and WIDA alt students in there as well.
I'm a little confused. Would decrease by about 4%, and your current is 7,600, and your proposed is 5,400?
Those are the current numbers out of all the English learners, yeah. Those are the current students who would exit right now with our current exit criteria, about that 7,600. And if we were to use these criteria, 5,400-ish would exit. So that would mean that the pool of English learners across the state would increase, which would mean that districts would have more English learners that need support in their schools. But especially when we think about those students at those more advanced levels, we are really strongly encouraging districts to move away from just using an ESL pullout method and to really, again, think about how they can push those more advanced students into the regular classroom setting and get their instruction through that authentic language. So that's really an area where we think that districts who might have a higher number of advanced students could really benefit those students a lot to move them from that 4.2 to the 4.4. So it would create a larger pool of English learners across the state. But again, those are students who still need support in their English language development in order to be able to make the most out of their general content coursework. Yeah.
So we're just setting the bar for exit for the alt exam, right? So then I'm confused by, you said this includes alt and non-alt, but
right.
Have students, ESL, I can never figure out which term, students who are English learners who also have disabilities and take the alt, have they not had an exit criteria before that? They were just presumed to stay in EL services in perpetuity?
Yeah, we are setting that exit criteria so that those students can demonstrate proficiency and exit from services.
So historically, they just stayed in services. There was no exit unless they met the criteria for gen ed kids who were exiting.
They wouldn't have, there was no exit criteria for them. So since the administration in 2017, they would have just been staying in services because there wasn't a point determined of proficiency. And so that's what we're trying to do right now, is to set that point so that they can.
So prior to right now, like all the years in the past, the students with disability, in the 1% who qualified for the alt just stayed in EL services?
Since we've been administering the WIDA alternate assessment, yeah, that's what's been happening.
And how long have we been administering that?
We started in 2017, so it's a new assessment for us.
And what did we do for kids with disabilities who were EL learners in that, like, with significant cognitive disabilities before that?
They were just receiving that kind of the coordination of services, and they would have a lot of consultation with their ESL provider on their IEP team about that. But there wasn't any really like strong exit path for those students.
They didn't take any version of the WIDA or?
The WIDA access? No, they didn't have an assessment before that. And so the WIDA alt is a new assessment for us. And Jan can probably, because she has the historical context.
She looks like she's got some information for me.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, hello.
I've been on leave, and so Katie and Adam have followed up with all
Would
of
you
this.
please identify yourself?
I'm sorry. I'm Jan Lanier. I'm the Director of English Learner Immigrant and Migrant Programs. Thank you. With the old No Child Left Behind, the law said that they had to meet the same criteria.
Okay.
Which is not fair. And there has been a lot of pushback on that from Title III directors for years. And so the law was reauthorized as ESSA. We now have a way that we can set exit criteria. And so we had not given the alt the first couple of years that we were a WIDA state. That was a decision made at the department. And we didn't have data sufficient. So now we have enough data that we feel like we can set this at a reasonable level. There were students exiting because districts often have their own exit policy. But under ESSA, exit and entrance has to be standardized across a state. Before, there was a little bit more leeway with students with disabilities. And so we're trying to set this. The A is where they're still growing, they're achieving. That P is where they meet some level of proficiency.
And is it, since you're up there, is it an online assessment? I mean,
It is an
portfolio for.
It is
the
an
1%.
online assessment, but it can also be done by paper. It has sections, it's an individual decision that the district and the teachers at that school make, how that test is administered.
But it's a standard test.
It is a standard test.
You know, we had portfolio, I'm just trying to figure out what, because this isn't, I don't have a lot of information, and since it's new, I want to
And
make
it is
sure.
online, and we can send you the link. It
I would
is
love-
online with WIDA,
Okay.
and you can see some samples of it.
Okay,
there.
I would love to see that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So in summary, our most recent data does suggest that increasing this WIDA access exit criteria is going to be appropriate to ensure that our students have that English language proficiency that they really need to be able to be successful in their content coursework. And given that our students taking the WIDA Alt don't have a way to exit from ESL services, we want to establish that exit criteria, and our analysis suggests that that P1 exit is both equitable and academically appropriate. And finally, we are aware that these exit criteria will result in an overall exit rate for students across the state, and that would require districts to provide ESL services to a greater number of students.
So one final question is, have you worked with the districts and included them as part of this process?
Yes, especially when, I'll talk about the WIDA Access and then the WIDA Alt. With the WIDA Alt, since it is brand new and all of this analysis is brand new, what we actually did is we started by working with our ESL regional advisors, and we shared much more kind of thorough analysis of the WIDA Alt with them and got their feedback. And generally, they were incredibly happy to have a way to exit students. And they also recommended that we talk to ESL teachers who administer the WIDA Alt to get a sense from them. They're working with these students. When they see these students, is this an adequate level for these students to exit from services? So we actually provided a short webinar for those teachers and got their feedback on it. And in general, the feedback has been very positive about setting this exit criteria. And for WIDA Access, we've just been communicating the need to continuously be updating our exit criteria for at least a year now, and districts are very aware that we plan to recalibrate exit criteria occasionally to be able to make sure that our students are exiting at a point. So we communicated this last year, the need to continuously update our exit criteria at the ESSA Directors Institute in August, again at the TNT SOL conference in 2018 in October. So we've been communicating this pretty consistently. And generally, I think districts are nervous but excited.
Communicating is one thing, hearing from them is another thing, and so, I mean, they're going to need to know what the impact is financially for them. So.
I probably have one more, and then I'm going to stop. I just want to make sure I understand. So students who are taking the WIDA Alt have an ILP and an IEP?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
And I'll ask at the risk of running close on time, but I think we're okay to go a little over if everybody's good with that, just given the travel time we've built in. But two quick questions. I know we're tabling our accountability conversation for a later date, but how would this affect accountability potentially for districts, given that ELPA factors pretty prominently in our current accountability model? And my second question, sort of related to that, is, you know, with the ILP, I know with our schools that we monitor in the charter sector that we oversee, we do some desktop monitoring of that ILP, but what does that look like at the department, especially because you'll have more students who are sort of not necessarily receiving full services, but would need some sort of monitoring to ensure they're getting what they need?
For the accountability piece, I can't speak specifically to what that would look like, but we can get you an analysis that looks at that, and I want to make sure that we provide you with accurate information on that, so I might have to follow up with you on that component. But for the ILP and the monitoring, we do, as a part of the consolidated funding application and as a part of our general results-based monitoring and desktop monitoring process, We look at ILPs for students, and we look at transition monitoring forms for transition students to see what data districts are collecting before they make those decisions about what kind of supports they're going to provide for students that have transitioned, and then especially what decision-making process they go through if they decide they want to reclassify a student back into ESL services. So we do monitor those annually.
And just for context, I think the population is certainly growing for EL students, but isn't it approaching something like 60,000 across the state, or do you know what the current number is?
We had about 52,000, and it's increasing.
Thanks.
So if I interpret the data right earlier, there's roughly 2,000 plus students that would be impacted by the shift. I'm assuming they're not evenly distributed, meaning it's mostly Shelby and Davidson, or what is, and do we know the numbers then?
I don't have, do you happen to have the exact numbers of where they're distributed?
Just in terms of the general distribution of English learners across the state in different districts, is that?
Or just specifically the 7,600 current versus the 5,400 in the new formulation? So there's roughly 2,000 students impacted. Of those 2,000, like, is it an 80-20 kind of?
I don't recall the numbers precisely, so
Or even roughly, like, is it more,
it's generally the same as the distribution of English learners across the state. So if a third, for example, are in Metro, roughly a third of those exiting are going to be from Metro.
Got it. And can you remind me again what the distribution is? So if a third are roughly in Metro, how many are in Shelby versus?
It's a third in Metro. Do you remember Shelby?
Two counties. I wonder, Bob, if we're talking to the same people, because I am a little nervous about the difference between communication versus hearing. And when 2, maybe 3, I'm guessing, districts are going to feel in an outsized way the impact of any change, it seems to me exceedingly important to really understand where the challenges are going to be, and how we can help. And yeah, because I don't fully get the sense that, I don't know if I would have described excited to the people that I've talked to, and so there is some kind of disconnect here. And so I do think it's important to really listen and understand. And frankly, I will be, with that kind of a distribution, I would pay most attention to those 2 or 3 districts, because it's going to be at massive scale that they feel this impact. If there's, just on that math alone, over 1,000 kids are probably going to be in 1,000 kids are going to be just in those 2 counties. So, and I think they're really feeling the pressure of the fact that they already have vacancies at the moment, 20 in Metro, as I said, alone. So this doesn't make it easier. Again, I understand, like, I'm obviously a big proponent of high expectations, like, all those things. I just think that, there's theory and then there's practice. And so I really want to better understand, like, what the real challenges are and how we really are going to solve for them.
One thing that we have done since we became a WIDA state, and this will be our 5th year to give the WIDA assessment, is we have no longer been doing our best to figure out what the criteria is at my desk. But we have the researchers in the department that are really looking at that. And districts have known for the last 4.5 years that periodically we will look at this and make sure as Tennessee standards are going up, that our standards for ESL are moving with them, and that the students can access those academic content standards. And so we do feel it's important that we do this, and we're charged by the Office of Civil Rights legislation to make sure that we're providing meaningful services. And so I think if we don't move our criteria at some point, and maybe next time it won't be every 2 to 3 years, maybe it'll be 6 years. But there's a huge difference if you're taking the ACT on a 16 and a 18, or an 18 and a 22. And so we're looking at that kind of movement here. We need to make sure that our students really can access the content, because we're violating we're not providing them with the services they need if they are put in a class and they can't access that. And that's what we worry about with the lower exit as our other standards are moving up. Does that help?
Yeah, that is sensible to me. I think what I am reacting to a bit is that there seems, at least in my interpretation, I could be misinterpreting it, but there seems to be some confusion about what it means to go from 4.2 to 4.4. You gave a theoretical sort of overview of why this matters, which completely resonates with me. I mean, that makes sense to me. I'm all for that. I don't know if that piece is missing or they actually understand that. They're just like wrapped up in the what we need to be true. What is the real difference between 4.2 and 4.4 for the practitioner and for kids? And so then what does that mean for us? Maybe it's like,
Okay.
yeah.
I think we can get you a better answer. I think we can look at some of the WIDA materials and get you a better answer to that. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is pre-K, K portfolio alternatives.
Perfect. Good morning, members of the board. Good morning, Executive Director Morrison. Happy to be here today. My name is David Allenson. I serve as the Assistant Commissioner for Human Capital. And for today, I'm presenting an update on the pre-KK student growth portfolios. So to kick things off, just a little bit of background on what they are. The thought process here was that teachers want to be valued for their individual contribution in the classroom, as opposed to receiving, as part of their evaluation model, how the whole school's doing. They want to be valued for their individual contribution. And so the pre-KK portfolio was an attempt to use student work that is already occurring in the classroom that can be collected, used. It's for ELA and math collections are made. And then in 2017-18, there was state law that mandated that the pre-KK portfolio must be used for anybody that accepts the voluntary pre-K funding. You'll see that those that use the student growth portfolio, that individual contribution is now 35% for their score, as opposed to if they, prior to that, or non-tested teachers, you're getting a much larger on the observation side, and you're getting a portion of your evaluation for how the whole school is doing, as again, opposed to your individual contribution. There's been some implementation challenges. I've been here for 3 months, and I've heard a lot from the field. It's been eye-opening, but for example, when you're using your third platform in 3 years, that's really difficult for teachers. I'm excited to say that we're going to be going into this next year with the same platform, so it'll be a second year, but 3 in 3 years is really tough to deal with. It's also been, really time-consuming for taking work, uploading it into the system. There has been past technological challenges with that. There's also been some concerns with training and things like that. But what I'm proud to say is that last year there was some significant improvements made. For example, there's been the consistency with the platform. There's been in-person trainings for peer reviewers and also how to use portfolios moving forward. And in May, June of 2019, we had in-person scoring days done as well. However, this is something that I thought was pretty interesting. Although this is already work that's happening in the classroom, over 30% of districts have had to spend, teachers have had to spend 2 days or more outside of the classroom, whether it's for training, whether it's for grading. And so that's, if it's meant to be something that is already happening, that was something that was an unintended consequence that has concerned some districts. In addition, 7 out of 10 pre-K and K teachers disagreed that the portfolio practice positively impacted their instruction. We took some quotes from teachers, and I thought what was interesting here was some teachers have expressed concerns around the subjectivity of the grading. Although there's a rubric model, there's still You're grading a student's work. There is some type of value judgment when is this, a 3 or a 4? Like when you're trying to determine on rubrics, there is going to be a user part to this that some teachers have expressed concern around. But what's really positive about this is that although there's been some things that we're working out on the portfolio side, there is, from the field, teachers, again, really appreciate the fact that they can be held accountable for their direct impact as opposed to the full school. I think just talking as somebody that's deeply passionate about equity and human capital, it's really important that we do individual contributions as part of teacher eval, because if I'm a principal in certain schools where the school-wide score may potentially negatively impact my score, it's going to struggle for me to recruit teachers if they're not going to be valued for for growth that they do. And so this is an equity issue as well as we do this work. So next steps, Chapter 376 of Public Act 2019 provided the state board with authority to adopt alternative measures of student growth for pre-K and K, in addition to the portfolio model. So in other words, we could have a yes and approach to this. Once alternative measures are approved by the board, LEAs that receive the voluntary pre-K money would be able to select this alternative measure if they so chose. And so just this past Tuesday, we held our portfolio review committee. We are tasked now with submitting a report to the House and Senate Education Committees next week, so it'll be a quick turnaround. But what I'm really excited about was the group. I was a part of it. My colleague, Dale Lynch from TOS, was a part of it. What we saw was people, again, agree we want that individual contribution, and that there are about, like what we heard, there's plenty of teachers, and even the teachers represented, they like portfolio, they want it improved, but then there's also some, directors of schools and other teachers that want to explore other options. The key message here is, again, individual contribution, let's be measured for that, but how that looks, let's have a conversation about that. And so I think where we're at is we want to work with the state board staff on taking potential alternatives that we can all agree are true, valid measures of student growth. We could curate an initial list of things of potential alternatives that we think meet this bar. Districts would like that as a starting point. That's actually something that Mr. Lynch had requested. But at the same time, districts could also propose, hey, can you look at this alternative idea? Would this count as a valid measure of student growth? In working with the state board staff, we would then come to you all for a first read to determine what could be approved as an alternative measure. And then there'll be more work with the directors of schools, engaging them, and we're excited to do that. I really appreciate all the questioning earlier about the theory versus the practice, and I'm a former teacher, principal, and assistant soup at 2 districts on talent and HR, so I couldn't align more that we should be here to support and serve. So I'm really excited to do this work and use the state board staff's expertise. We'll be working with our internal assessment and data team to make sure that these are valid measures and come back with proposals for you all to consider. Thank you, and any questions I'd be happy to answer.
I know we're tight on time. I just want a couple comments and then one question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I have definitely heard from kindergarten teachers in my own district that this was a real burden, and varying opinions on how much value there was compared to the burden. So I think it's consistent with what you've heard. I'm also very familiar with our former portfolio model for kids with significant cognitive disabilities, and I was not a fan of that, only because I don't know that it reflected, well, I know it did, in my opinion, it did not accurately reflect what the student, it was like a teacher chore more than what the student's knowledge was. So I'm 100% on board with figuring out something that reflects what the actual, the teacher's input has been. My question is, if you're presenting to the House and Senate committees, if there is a deck or a document you're presenting, if the board could get that, that would be really great, just so that we see what you're presenting to them. Sure. And you said in here you're going to keep, you're going to be coming to us and talking with our staff. I know, I think I speak for myself, but the rest of the board, we would love to be kept up to date on those conversations.
Yes, thank you, message received. For clarity, there were 9 recommendations that came out of the Portfolio Review Committee, and the report that we are writing up will be those 9 recommendations. We will make sure that State Board staff gets it, and however the process goes through Executive Director Morrison to reach you all. And honestly, like, it's actually really exciting walking into that room and seeing all the diverse stakeholders there, and yet to come to some agreements. And I mean, it was in my opinion, very collaborative environment that was focused on students, focused on understanding the impact to districts. I know Metropolitan Nashville has already reached out to me about the gold portfolio that they want us to consider. And we're like, yeah, we're going to look into it. And we'll vet and propose to you all.
Mr. Darnell.
Do we know if there was a spike in retirements and openings through this whole process?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It was it Chairman White who he used the word urban legend. He's like, is there truth to this urban legend that there's been on the pre-K and K specifically? And again, this conversation's focused on the pre-K portfolios. Is that's been the case? I will tell you this: we don't know that answer right now. And the rationale why is 2 reasons. One is, the current labor market data that we track, we'll be able to track once the next school year starts and say, hey, these teachers were employed this past year, they're not here this year. But I can tell you, as somebody that ran talent and HR for 2 districts, we don't have insight currently into district level vacancy data. So when I hear a comment about, ELL having 20 vacancies and how could this, it's like, that's the kind of data we need to even be able to answer that question, to even think about how it informs our proposals moving forward. And also when I first walked in here today, the passion about recruitment of teachers and how we do that, like, you gotta start with the data, and then you have to ask the right questions. And the only way you ask the right questions is by talking to teachers, talking to principals, talking to directors of HR. And so that's something that, the Commissioner Swin has been very clear that we need to do. We need to improve our engagement to be able to answer questions like that. So no, at this time, I do not know how to answer that, but I will be able to get you some high-level data at the next meeting based on our data and research team.
I would appreciate that. You think
Yes,
about
sir.
the core of education and where that begins. I mean, these people are saints.
Yeah.
I'm certified to teach kindergarten. That is not my calling. So, Lord willing, that license part will never be used. But you think about, we talk about the struggles, and for 3 years, correct? 3 years this has been in place, or some form or fashion.
Since 17-18, it's been mandated, but there have been other districts using it previously. Yeah.
And I look at this, and on the graph that you have, and it shows that 35%, over a third, roughly 35%. So we're looking at roughly over a third of teachers who receive no release time. And just to imagine the hours that you put into this, and then all of these issues. So it's disheartening when we talk about trying to recruit, but not only recruit, to keep good teachers. So I'm very interested in seeing the changes, and hopefully, with the flexibility, that's going to allow more teachers not to be so discouraged that all the time that they put into this may not pan out the way they thought it was.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Our focus is on continuing improvements for the 1920, but at the end of the day, the alternatives going through the board, going through rule and law, it will be more of an impact 2021 and beyond for the alternatives. And we're excited for directors of schools to engage their teachers to understand what they would prefer and then make requests through us. We're excited to facilitate that conversation.
I just want to reiterate what Nick has said, but also to expand on what we've talked about in recruitment of teachers. It's got to be 2 things. We got to focus on what it's going to take to recruit great teachers, including to kindergarten, and then we've got to focus on retention and why do people leave. And they leave for a lot of reasons. I mean, if we were to look at just the number of people, I mean, they may get married and move to Timbuktu, who knows? What we're wanting to know is why people left the profession
Mm-hmm.
because of the profession. And that's for specifically this and the whole thing. And that's gonna have to, we're gonna have to dig that out, but that's a major part of our to-do list.
Any other questions for me? Yes.
Just a comment in closing. I wanted to thank David in particular for his outreach to the state board staff. I know we're going to be in close conversation about this, and clearly it's something that we all care about. You know, I was in a role similar to David's at one point in time when we were rolling out portfolios in other areas, and I just remember it's super time intensive to do it well, and at that time districts were able to opt in, and so it was a choice. I worry a lot and have worried since this legislation that we put an undue burden on districts without really having the resources to support it at scale in a quality way. So I'm really appreciative of this conversation, of your collaborative approach with districts. Look forward to working with you on this.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Any other comments or questions? And without objection, the committee of the whole is adjourned and the board is adjourned. Dissolved and adjourned.